Okay, let's make a start. Welcome everybody to the February TELedvisors webinar. First for 2023, we have a super hot topic to talk about today, the AI ChatGPT future. Where are we and what are we going to do now? I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Those people who aren't familiar with the TELedvisors Network, we are a special interest group. We're part of ASCILITE, the Australasian Society for Computers in Learning in Tertiary Education. And we act as a community of practice, community of practitioners for people working in the education third space. So learning designers, education technologists, academic developers, all of those kinds of people. In terms of the session today, obviously we've got this wonderful panel before us. How we're going to run is we've come up with half a dozen or so questions that we're kind of going to work through. Please do put your questions into the Q&A. We're not running the chat because there's a lot of people, and after a certain point, chat just becomes impossible to follow. So please do have your conversations there. If you are in the back channel on Twitter, because I know I do that all the time, please use the hashtags TELedvisors or hashtag AIEd. I think that's about it. So I'm now going to hand over to Associate Professor Tim Fawns, who is my colleague at Monash. He works in the Monash Education Academy, and he will be your host for this session.
Thanks very much, Colin. It's an absolute thrill to be part of this chat with such an amazing panel of speakers with various different hats on, I think, today. And equally terrifying to be part of this chat in front of so many people. I think the latest numbers are about 2.4 billion, although some of those might be bots. So my job today, I'll introduce the panel, but my job today is to try and keep them under control. So good luck to me with that. The speakers, I'm going to have the chat running for you, but not the participants, in the hope that I can say, George, please stop talking. And if that doesn't work, then I'll wave frantically at you in really subtle style. And if that doesn't work, I'll just try and find the mute button. So without further ado, I will introduce the panel, then we'll have a few kind of established questions, and then we'll leave a bit of time for questions from the audience. So please do use that Q&A function, although some of the panelists might, if they get bored with what one of the other panelists is saying, answer some of those questions through typing. So you've already heard from Colin. Colin is an educational technologist at Monash University in Melbourne. In the teaching and learning portfolio, he's a leader of ASCILITE TELedvisors Network, which you have just heard about. He's also an EdTech columnist for the Campus Morning Mail, which is worth a read. We have Anna Mills, a teacher of writing at the College of Marin in San Francisco. That's right, isn't it, Anna? And we are calling you might not call yourself this, but we're calling you an AI in education thought leader. And as George said, you have started preparing a whole lot of fabulous resources that everyone should check out. Really, really helpful. Thank you for your work in that sector. We have Professor George Siemens at the University of South Australia, Adelaide, and George is very well known for his research into human and artificial cognition, the impact of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence on university systems. Really looking forward to hearing your perspective on all of this stuff. We have Anisha Bakaria, Senior Manager of Learning Analytics at the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation at University of Queensland, Brisbane. And I believe your PhD was in a really relevant field, so you've thought a lot about this for a lot longer than some of us. Trish McCluskey, Associate Professor and Director of Digital Learning at Deakin University in Melbourne, so overseeing some fantastic people as well as processes and systems. So I'm just going to throw this over. I think we maybe start with Anna, and then I will let others come in as they see fit, or if that's not happening, I'll prompt you via the chat. To the more immediate and practical stuff to start with, I think, what kinds of things do you think that educators can do right now to strengthen their assessments or feel better about the integrity of their assessments in the short term?
Well, I think my approach is that there's not one practice that's going to sort of address everything, but we can look at a range of options. The first thing I think is sort of obvious, but to focus on intrinsic motivation and engagement and clarifying why we're assigning writing and what students will get out of the process of writing itself, that writing is a tool for thinking. So, you know, kind of foregrounding that even more than we already do. Establishing policies at the class level, maybe asking students to affirm that their work is their own. Establishing a norm of transparency around what is AI text and what is human, I think is going to be really important. And we might want to, at this point, mention that AI identification software exists and is evolving. That's a big conversation that's controversial, but perhaps students should know that that is a possibility, and that you know, we shouldn't go into this imagining that we can use an AI text generator and keep that private forever in every situation and claim that we put those words together. So if we can just sort of start to have that be part of the norm around these tools. And, you know, we can experiment with our own prompts and see if we can adapt them so that ChatGPT is not very good at them. That is tricky. There are some ways to make it harder to use ChatGPT to do a passable job on a writing assignment, maybe analyzing multimedia, analyzing longer texts, referring to class discussion or peer collaborative annotations. Nothing is foolproof, but we can also look to some sort of tried and true writing pedagogy strategies for assigning steps in the writing process, conferences with students, allowing some time for in-class writing that students can then build on. So all of those things can help make it more attractive for students to do their own work and to disclose if and when they are using some kind of AI assistance. So maybe I'll stop there.
Well, that's great. That's a lot of territory, and I guess you're talking about a balance or a multiple approach of thinking about ways to make it assessments more secure, and thinking about ways of motivating students to do things and designing things that they work differently. Does anyone want to wade into the controversy? We may as well start there. Wade into the controversy around detection and technological kind of approaches to dealing with academic integrity.
Yeah. So I think one of the main things is just the way that these tools are going to be embedded in just normal things. So, you know, Microsoft's come on board and jumped on board really early. So we'll probably have Microsoft integrating with these technologies. Tools like Notion and Canva already have integrations in beta. I think sometimes students won't even know that they're using it. The trouble with the detection is that we're always going to be playing catch up. So I think, you know, OpenAI introduced a new little classifier tool yesterday, and I've been playing with GPT-0. There's large false positives. Basically, the more you prompt and the more you direct the output, the less accurate it's going to be when people's own ideas get into it. And the moment I think the first tweet I saw about the detection software from OpenAI itself, what I basically found about it was straight after that, there was a tweet with someone using something called GPT-0 or GPT-1, which was actually paraphrasing. So you could take your AI generated text, it's classified as AI generated text, and essentially it found synonyms, paraphrased it, and then the detection software failed. I do think there's a lot of work still happening in this space to try and make it that way. I think, with the amount of startups in the space and paid services that are coming from OpenAI exposing this as an API, it's going to be really hard to police. And I think this is where, I think it's not so much rethinking assessment, but, I think it's perhaps quite controversially embracing some of these new technologies. And so I actually feel much more optimistic about ChatGPT in education versus the predecessor, just GPT-3. And I think the game changer for me really was that it was able to take feedback rather than just you give it, generate this and it gave it back to you. It could take feedback, you could evolve it, you could direct it. In my experience with it, there's a lot more evaluative judgment and critical thinking. And so I think as educators, the move forward would be not to just accept the first, or to build student competencies, to not just accept the first output that these systems give us. I mean, and it's using it as a starting point, and then using all our human skills and our human knowledge and creativity to actually rapidly iterate and direct the output into what we would like to evolve it into. And at that point, I think this is where perhaps assessment artifacts could actually be looking at things like the actual prompt history to see how you as a human directed the output and changed it and delivered something of much higher quality. And, when thinking of that, those are higher level skills. And at some point, it's self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and base competencies that also need to be developed. And I'd love to see more discussion with curriculum about what's the right point to introduce these after these base competencies are established, essentially, and perhaps even it's us moving rubrics further along. And so what was a credit no longer is a credit, and what used to be a distinction is now a credit.
That's a lot
opening
of
up loads. Yeah, opening up loads of territory. Sorry, Colin. Lots
of ground covered in that, and I agree. I think that particularly the detection side of things, it's going to be an arms race. I don't know if that's necessarily going to solve the issues, and I actually come back to a lot of what Anna had to say in terms of the way that we design learning and teaching activities, and not just assessments, but just the way we actually use this in learning and teaching is going to be much more significant. And yeah, I think all of the things, like obviously we consider the limitations of the tool right now, the fact that some of the data sets are a little bit older. So if you're talking about current news stories, it's a little bit harder for the technology to kind of, fake it. Getting people looking at images and analyzing and just evaluating and sort of the higher order stuff in Bloom's taxonomy, essentially. I think that there's I don't know, I feel like there is still a lot that can be done in the way that we teach. And look, I mean, there's two sides to this question as well, but maybe other people on the panel did want to talk about the educational approaches that we might take. Trish.
Yeah, I was just, as I was listening to you speak, Anisha, I was reminded of Maslow's law of the instrument, which says that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if we position our students as, in the negative of being cheaters rather than eager, curious learners, then we tend to look for that. And I know that in all of our conversations around ChatGPT, it has become, in some camps, cheap GPT. That's the focus rather than looking at what the options are, the opportunities are for us to actually use it for good.
So turning that slightly towards concerns around students rather than, the issue of worrying about students' integrity. Anna, could you contribute to the discussion around the privacy concerns, especially to do with detection of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think it's an important concern that someone raised in the Q&A too, that we really shouldn't just be copying and pasting our students' writing into a third-party tool when we don't know what they'll do with that data. And we haven't established through the institution some kind of contract with permissions negotiated there around the data. So I think that's an important point that I learned from Mark Watkins of University of Mississippi. I would hesitate. I would say, you know, if we're going to use detectors, we really would have to ask for the student's permission. My vision of the detectors also is a little bit that it could help facilitate use and education about these tools, because it helps us to continue to distinguish between what's human and what's AI, and continue to reflect on what are we getting from the AI, where's that coming from. As Anisha mentioned, we might want to watch the transcript of a chat session where it's clearly labeled what the student says and what ChatGPT says. We might want to use the identifiers to help us keep those distinct when students turn in their writing. But I do think that the data privacy needs to be resolved before we try to use any kind of detection tool at scale. And we also need to recognize that these tools are currently not at all reliable. They have a lot of false positives and false negatives, and there are so many ways to evade them. It will be an arms race. So maybe if we're going to use them, we could develop a way to use them that's more collaborative with students, rather than, you know, we're threatening you with expulsion. That it could be more of one opening for discussion with the student that's not about questioning their integrity. That's what I'm interested in developing.
Thank you. So I want to hear from George in a second, but before we do, maybe this was a good one for you, Trish. Thinking about all the things that we've talked about so far, what do you think are the key considerations from an institutional response point of view? Not speaking for Deakin, but just broadening it out. If you are an institution, what are the main factors you're thinking about when you're coming up with a response to this situation?
I think traditionally, whenever we've had new technology, and I've been around the sector for a long time, we get warning of it, we buy it, we have contracts, we, plan for its rollout, we get the information for staff, we run workshops, then we soft launch it, and then we hold people's hands. This has just arrived, and none of us know how to navigate it because it's not as stable as it's been in the past. And I'm getting continuous responses from staff to, can we have a workshop? Well, it's changing all the time. So you might run a workshop on something and says, use only information pre-2021. Well, it could be that next week it's updated with everything that's post-2021. So it's a continuously shifting space. At Deakin, what we've done, I'm sorry to speak about Deakin, is that we've taken a 4A approach. So we're actually talking about raising students' awareness and staff awareness of it, getting people to acknowledge that they've actually used it. So putting it into either citations or something that identifies that it has been used to support the submission of an assessment. Looking at our assessments, are they fit for purpose? Could they be done by a bot? And also looking at authenticity that can be mapped across a whole program. So we're trying to take a four-pronged approach to it with staff and students. This is not just about getting staff up to speed or making sure that students are not using it. And I think that we can co-create that with our students. They've been using it for years, various iterations of it.
Thank you. So given this shifting landscape and the way everything changes, I might come to you, George, for this one, if it's okay. What do you think the role of research is here? And are the researchers and the experts being listened to? And I suppose relatedly, who are the experts in this territory?
That's important questions, and I think there's a component here that's interesting. So just by way of a little bit of background, obviously we've heard so much development about AI for a long time, but all of it was disconnected, right? It's almost like it escaped the lab in the form of ChatGPT. We were reading articles about Blake Lemoine and Lambda with the Google platform, and we were reading articles about whatever platform beats whatever lead expert in Go or chess or pick something, and even strategy games. And so I think part of the hype that we're experiencing right now, which feels like it's Web 2.0 blended with MOOCs and then amplified, is what it sounds like, because you just can't get away from it. But so the there's an important conversation happening here, which is a sense-making conversation. And a sense-making conversation is when we're whacking our way through a jungle and trying to say, like, what the hell is this thing? Like, is this important? What does it mean here? What does it mean there? What are the implications in how I teach next week? How's this reflected in my classroom? What should I do? You know, and we're all in the middle of that right now. And these kinds of events are part of it. I think there's, at least I'm aware of another 5 or 6 panels or webinars of this sort that are going on within the next 2 weeks. And through Grail, we're hosting several of those ourselves. But what I think is important now is exactly this. It's a sense-making conversation of trying to orient what this is potentially and what it means. And that's why we're getting all of the usual, oh, you know, it's this in this kind of a context, or it's, you know, it is the, I don't know, the Napster of something. I'm just, you know, waiting for those kinds of conversations to arise. But that's what we're trying to do. We know it's different. And I think one of the challenges is we start to use it in a way that wants to put it in a very natural kind of a psychology of learning lens into a category that allows us to stabilize this and apprehend it in a way that we feel okay with what it is. So I want to honor the importance of the practical side of it and the conversations that, you know, Colin raised about the design aspect and the learning implications, and, you know, what others have shared, you know, Trish, about the inexperience of students, or Anna, you're talking about the use of plagiarism detection software, and the list goes on. These are all critical components. The research lens, to finally get to your question, I think is one of those slow burns, right? When your house is on fire, you're not looking for your life insurance or for your house insurance policy. You're trying to get everybody out, and then you're going to sit down and look at, okay, what are we up against? I've already started to see at least 2 or 3 academic articles peer-reviewed that made it through some kind of a process with a ChatGPT focus. But it's worth emphasizing, ChatGPT is just a small part of a much broader suite of tools that have been adopted for an extended period of time. You know, we've run, I guess coming up this year, our 4th conference in, you know, empowering learners for the age of AI, which we've covered everything from, could be robotics, it could be, in this case, automation tools, predictive analytics tools. ChatGPT gives us a brief sensory experience with a really complex piece of technology. You know, the large language model that we're interacting with, sometimes it's ridiculous, but it's sane enough for us to keep listening to. It's kind of like, you know, you go to a pub and you meet somebody and they're talking nonsense, but sometimes they're saying something really interesting. So you're not quite sure, is this going to be a fun conversation, or are we going to go off the deep end at any point? And that's the ChatGPT conversation. And research, I think, is the group that has to unpack that. There are, as I'm aware of now, 4 NSF-funded research programs out of the US looking at AI and robotics. One that was just announced that looked at, you know, sort of language and disability focus that was announced, I think, yesterday. There's adult learning, and that's run by James Lester out of North Carolina. And there's another sort of lifelong learning angle that's run with the Georgia Tech system. Out of Europe, Inga Molnar was just received a 60 million euro grant around AI and lifelong learning. And in Australia, I know there have been attempts to get a similar approach research-wise. So to your question, the final one is that the researchers you should be listening to are really any of those center leads or any individuals from my lens. I'm coming at it very specific lens, which is through the learning analytics legacy into this space. That's sort of the door to which I arrived to this. There's a lot of other perspectives out of Monash as well. I know Neil Selwyn's doing quite a bit of critical work. I know University of Edinburgh has applied a critical lens to this conversation as well. So I'm just trying to emphasize, I speak from a perspective that I unabashedly believe that AI is a critical part of the future of education. I unabashedly believe that there's fundamental systems change that needs to happen in that conversation. And right now I'm at the let it burn stage, right? Like, let's figure out what this is rather than force it into an existing perspective. But the research needs to become more central to the conversation, because I'm hearing a lot of people who've never looked at AI extensively, don't have a research framework to interact with AI, that are getting airtime on what it is and what it isn't. But there's individuals that have been, you know, Google's team that was disbanded that looked at algorithmic bias, you know, any of the individuals that left that team, you know, Melanie Mitchell is a fantastic researcher that people should be tracking. There's all the traditional Hinton, LeCun, Gary Marcus, Bengio, and others that people should be tracking as well. So there's a range of researchers, core researchers in this landscape to pay attention to. But I think right now is a moment of sense making with the research team coming on a little bit behind, but all of that still says it's this systems effect is the part that really matters and how that cashes out.
Fantastic. There are a lot of thumbs up to let it burn. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I suppose there are a lot of potential thumbs. So there are a lot of people who didn't put their thumbs up to that as well. But thinking about, okay, this is going to keep being a thing going forward. The next question is going to be around how do we get everybody, students, teachers, educational stakeholders, to build their digital or AI literacy, whatever that means. I don't know if we know what that means yet. And also thinking about how that's connected to other types of literacies to do with the practice of education and assessment. Nobody volunteered to answer that in the chat, but whoever speaks, oh, Trish is, there you go, Trish. And then we haven't heard from Anisha or Colin for a bit. No pressure.
I'm happy to have a go at it, Tim, but I'm not sure that I actually have an answer. And I'd have to say that, you know, artificial intelligence literacy is an extension of digital literacy. But even now, a lot of people don't have the ability to even enter a valid Google search. We don't know how to use Google well in terms of searches. Using Boolean language, which is something we were taught years ago. So we have to actually work with academics who understand, teach them how to teach students. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of actually how we get it to the students by empowering or enabling the academic staff to know what activities they might use, looking at things like currency, validity, reliability, doing evaluative judgment on the source of the information and the transparency. And we also have to model ethical use of it, because ethics is a huge thing. I think there's so much opaqueness in some of the origins and the algorithms associated with ChatGPT and the raft of other tools that are out there.
I can jump in next. So I think just from, not claiming to really be an expert, I've really been playing with the technology for a little bit now since it got released. And my advice really is, especially for academics or anybody else doing this, and I do see a huge role for learning designers as well in this space, is to learn advanced prompting. And, I'm seeing a lot of people on Twitter and, LinkedIn, whatever. I'm taking my assessment and I'm copying the question exactly as it is and pasting it in and seeing what comes to return and then picking out weaknesses from it. My advice is there's actually a whole nother field that's being established at the moment called prompt engineering. And so this is where you're actually rephrasing things so that these language models better understand it. Chain of thought prompting is where you're actually giving examples. So you can, ask a question and then actually give a few examples and show reasoning, and then you get better results coming from it. And so those are all the sorts of things that people need to be aware of, and using it for more productivity type tasks will get you into that kind of digital literacy. And these are also the skills that students are going to need. But what does kind of concern me is that we're thinking of the cheating element really being that the AI generated my assessment item for me. I think once people start putting in their own input and get their own ideas into these tools, they can craft new solutions and improve the quality of what's coming out. But for me, the cheating is not really going to be that I've used AI directly from these systems. The cheating might actually be that I've built this really great prompt and it returns really good results and it's got all the feedback built into it and stuff like that. And I'm now sharing that with other students, or there's prompt mills, as I'm kind of thinking of it, where you can go and buy these particular prompts, for different types of assignments and stuff like that. Maybe that's that level of cheating. And that's where we need to be more concerned.
And that sits so far to the side of what we would conventionally see as cheating, this kind of collaborative generation of prompts. Like, no one's even thought about stuff like that. I'm quite excited about this. I wanted to come back to a couple of things. I think the things that sort of Trish was saying about how essentially, yeah, like we really, okay, let me start again. What I think this is really doing is forcing us to really take a look at the standard of quality, the standard of learning and teaching practice in institutions. And many of the suggestions that I've seen, particularly in the resources that Anna has shared, are all stuff that as educator, advisors, learning designers, academics, whatever, we've been advocating for many years, you know, more authentic learning experiences, more reflection, all of these kind of things. And now it's like, we have to do this because it's essentially taken us from this level up to this level in terms of what knowledge becomes. I think in the same way that, you know, calculators remove the need to be able to do calculations with a slide rule or, you know, in your head or whatever, that bit of mathematics is gone. So now you're working at the next level where you've just got that tool and you use it, and now you're thinking at a richer level about maths. And we're doing that except with writing or concepts or information or knowledge. And institutions are going to need to invest in raising teaching standards and having a much clearer understanding of what good learning and teaching needs to look like.
Nice. There's so much more to say. Anna's putting things in the chat about how critical AI literacy can also mean teaching students to recognize errors, fabrications, and bias in outputs. George is talking about the importance of moving assessment conversations from product to process. Unfortunately, I'm going to skip over those points because we need to get also to the audience questions, but we may cover some of that stuff in those questions. The next move I want to make is to the idea of equity and access to artificial intelligence technologies and tools as they become commercialized. And will they just become a tool for the rich, and what are the implications for education of that? Anisha, I think you volunteered to come in on this one.
Yeah, so to me, this is something that's really concerning me at the moment. So at the moment, there is a free version of ChatGPT, but we've seen how rapidly lots of people started using it, and then paid pro plans have come. So you're paying about $42 a month for it. There's a new plan for $20, which is kind of shoring up that you have access when you need access. So, you know, I don't think these tools are really expensive to train, and they're really expensive at the inference level. And so it's not going to be free forever. And I think even in including it in our class technologies, you know, you can't be reliant on the free version of these things. But more concerning to me really is that the whole OpenAI model is that all of this is exposed as APIs. And so you've got a number of third-party startups and providers that use their APIs, but they fine-tune it. And when I talk about fine-tuning, they're actually taking a new customized data set and running it over that, fine-tuning it, asking it questions, checking the answers that it's giving, providing feedback, and they come up with a new customized model. And this is how you're getting these paid services, some of which might be more fine-tuned for actually university assessments, but this is how you've got things like Jasper.ai for, you know, social media posting. A lot of these are also incorporating things like including references. Perplexity.ai does that, live integration with Wolfram Alpha for mathematical stuff, but these are all going to be paid applications. And so that's a really unfair equaling ground for students as a starting point. And that I have no answers other than say, just be aware of it. And, you know, it leads me to thoughts of, you know, contract cheating sites. They would have access to a full data set for university written assessment, and they could fine tune it and set up a new business. these are scary things with the future that, we really need to start thinking about.
I'm happy to jump in there, Tim. I think that the digital divide has been an issue for us right through the pandemic and always has been. Some students will have access to the open version of it, which may be some part of what the paid one is. So even if they do keep a version that is open access, that creates problems as well. But I think in terms of equity, it is also an equalizer in terms of providing students with more scaffolding and support and personalization of their learning. So those students who perhaps have struggled with the traditional model, by actually having this, it creates a better sense of equity because they can actually use it to self-teach, to self-learn, to practice, rehearse their answers or their knowledge in using the tool. And I shouldn't call it a tool. Someone said on social media yesterday, but anyone who continues to call it a tool is a tool. Thank you.
Yeah, but Trish, don't believe everything that those people say on the internet.
Brian Alexander, I think I better cite my sources.
There.
Brian Alexander, I think.
So why does he not? Why does he not think
AI
it's
is a fantastic tool?
It's that concept of it's almost post-human. It's not just a tool that we use. It's something that's going to grow and evolve with us. Don't know, haven't read enough about it, but I was fascinated by the concept.
I think it's a structural imposition of a language game. And I think we're early in the conversation on this, that we don't need to do that yet. I think we can have a lot of conversations without active policing of the particular type of language you're using. And I say that because we're in the sense mode. Every opinion right now, ridiculous or not, has a place to sit in this conversational ecosystem. And so I think I'm a little worried if we're like, well, you can't say exactly this or you can't say exactly that because that's the outcome. There is no outcome yet. We don't have a structure on which we can hang this as a tool. Efficient moderation, Tim. Nisha made a really good point about the equity dynamics of it. If you bring this into a classroom, $20 a month for the pro version out of the US, which is where it's only available right now, is going to put a lot of students out of reach in that landscape. They say, well, there'll be a free version, but then now you have the same thing. There's certain better things in the paid version and you have an unequal landscape. So I think that is a first doorway that needs to be addressed in the conversation. After we've passed through that doorway, I would suggest almost all conversations related to AI and ChatGPT in education are secondary to my thinking to the enormous potential that this has for a creative explosion, for an innovative way of engaging and interacting with the world. I'm not trying to belittle that there's concerns that are there, but I'm trying to say, you know what? I get it. It's fantastic. There's a risk that if I go to Tahiti that I might get a virus once I'm there. I'm going to figure out how to deal with the medical system later. So, but I do want to emphasize the one that's non-negotiable are the equity and the harm that can be caused, especially to minority population. That one needs to be tackled up front. But beyond that, I hope we don't focus too much on all of this peripheral stuff that has to be navigated. And we ignore this stunning potential. I mean, it is amazing to sit there and have it recite how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in the style of King James. Like it's just a fun thing to morph information from a JavaScript code into Python and to have that happen in real time. I mean, that is everything else, aside from the equity and the harm conversation, is a secondary concern. So bring on the good stuff and backfill the visit to ER later.
You've done a beautiful job for me, because the next question was going to be, what are the key things that you would like educators to know about artificial intelligence technologies, not tools, and the kinds of advances that they can expect in the next year? We'll go to Anisha first, but I suspect George will have a few things to say on that as well.
All right, can I just quickly interrupt
Yes,
for a second? This is actually just a request to attendees. In the Q&A, we've now activated the ability to upvote questions. Obviously, there's a lot of questions. There's 90 odd questions in there. If you could go through and just vote for the questions that you like the most, that might help us actually make some progress on those questions. Sorry, thank you.
Although I don't promise to adhere to your voting system. It's not a democracy. But yes, it will help us. It will help indicate. Yeah, so Anisha, what are the things you think educators, what are the things you would like educators to know about ChatGPT and other technologies and the advances they can expect in the next year? And if George or Anna or anybody else has good things to say, then just come in on the back of that, please.
So I think what's already happening is a race with startups in all its the different directions and fine-tuning data sets. From the educational perspective, I think it's going to be much easier to actually build a chatbot with reasoning that can actually answer questions related to your course content, because it's going to be easier to build semantic search that's fine-tuned on your course. And I'm starting to see this from different websites and different sites. So it's much better than any of the chatbots that are currently out there. And it can also do things like explain things in better ways to students. So, you can go, I'm struggling with this particular concept, and even have things like study advisors recommending learning strategies to students and stuff like that. I think this is the question of, should educators be actually making lesson plans and generating content? My thoughts on this is we're really thinking of this as static content, and, do we really want our educators, instead of writing things out fully, to be using this technology when we don't want students to be using it and things like that? So my thinking on that really is, if we move away from thinking of the output of these systems as static content and static lesson plans, which you might already have, and more to the level that it's going to be dynamic, interactive, question answering, and concept explaining systems that we can build around to actually help students that might be having trouble or want to, make different notes about things and things like that. That takes it to that different level. I think the key thing also for educators and learning designers is just the productivity aspect. I would not really encourage anybody at this point in time, until there's clear guidance from, your employee about generating this content and using it in your work, like, doing paper writing with it or doing other things. But for me, the big potential and opportunities are actually in not what we are expert in. So it's those other tasks that we have to do. It might be that you have a table in a certain format and you need it in another format, in LaTeX for your paper. ChatGPT is great at converting those formats. It might be that there's a range of other technologies that, you as a learning designer, you are working with a platform that supports HTML and you want to customize things, and something's errored out. You just copy that HTML, get ChatGPT to try and fix it for you. So these are these side tasks that we have to do. I've even seen things like someone not know how to use Excel, but describe the problem in ChatGPT, and it actually is replying with, here's what you do as your formulas for these particular cells, and it knows how to do that kind of stuff really well. These are all things that can help us in productivity without really infringing on, our core learning designer pedagogy knowledge or writing for us, or, in any of those particular areas. So I really encourage people to experiment with those particular tasks that they're doing, where they're not expert, but they have to do it day to day. And you're usually landing up using Google search to try and find something. ChatGPT might know the direct answer. So that would be my advice to educators.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are significant numbers of rumors that GPT-4 is coming out soon, or that OpenAI is planning to come out with a version that's significantly better. And that the underlying structure of the technology is likely to remain the same. So there are certain limitations to what language models can do, because they're looking at word prediction. They're not drawing on sort of an underlying reasoning structure or ground truth. And this is something Gary Marcus talks about a lot. But So even when we might use them to learn things, there are kinds of errors and fabrications that we might see that are coming from that they're just predicting what words are likely to go together. They don't necessarily, they're not, operating out of understanding in the way that we might be. So we're likely to still see those kinds of structural limitations, and we're likely to see some big, potentially big jumps in quality. We can't count on, some of the mistakes that they're currently making or limits on the outputs now. All in there.
Great. So this has been fantastic, and I suppose we could be talking for hours on this, but because we only have 15 minutes left, it seems appropriate to shift across to audience Q&A. And there are a lot of popular questions about acknowledgement and referencing. So I might just smush them all into a garbled version that I come up with and then throw it open to the field. And it seems to me to boil down to practical advice around how we might treat the referencing of artificial intelligence, the interrogation of references produced by artificial intelligence, and the ways in which we might define acceptable and unacceptable uses of artificial intelligence within assignments.
We're just going to drop a quick note in there, Tim, on that. I think it's a good question. There was a large language model that Meta developed called the Galactica. They ran for about 3 days, and then people got extremely upset because it was literally just making up citations. One thing that's important to look at, ChatGPT is currently taking all the oxygen out of the room, but it's a small company, OpenAI. It's been very well designed from a public-facing interface. For me, by far, the big elephant in the room is Google and Google's very broad range of platforms. Some of their protein folding research that they've done through DeepMind has the capacity to change the quality of humanity's life everywhere, beyond teaching us how in ChatGPT how to make a recipe for pasta and a related shopping list. So there's real practical work that AI is doing in research labs. It's unfortunate that ChatGPT is drawing that oxygen out. As sort of the sole entity. There's a lot of other things going on that I think are quite a bit more impactful down the road. So I just want to briefly flag that that's something I don't want us to lose sight of, is that that's going to become a growing conversation that we need to focus on.
I was just wondering if Trish, as someone sort of in a leadership role in this space, you might be able to tell us a little bit about the direction Deacon's taking when it comes to expectations of citations and referencing. Have you frozen? I think Trish.
Nicely played, Trish. Nicely played.
Well, in that case, I might speak to it a little bit. Some of obviously this has been a significant discussion that I've certainly seen. And one of the better responses I actually saw was from University of California, San Diego. I thought their policy response has been really sensible. And I think I actually pinched that from Anna's collection of resources. And it's essentially acknowledgement. If you don't acknowledge that you're using the tool, then yeah, it's essentially contract cheating. So in the student work, obviously you need to work out how much is acceptable. I mean, are you providing track changes on your document so that you can see which parts you've imported, which parts you've actually written? Do you go through a series of steps where you're showing draft so you can actually see the development of your work? Or are you showing the prompt that you used and the changes that you made to that? I think this is probably the big conversation that we need to be having in terms of assessment work and just acknowledgement and referencing and citation of it. Now, I'm aware that there's a bunch of academic journals and scientific journals that are saying, yeah, you cannot have ChatGPT as a co-author. And I guess that kind of makes sense. But yeah, bringing it back to the practical kind of education focus. I was just wondering if anyone had specific thoughts on that. or we can move on to another question.
I'm pointing to Anna in the chat, but Anna may not be prepared. You might want to do a Trish. What you do, right, is you just hold your face really, really still for about 3 seconds, and then we assume there's a technical problem, and we move on to someone else.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wasn't quite ready for that one.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, okay, nobody knows the answer to some of these questions. That's fine. We're still working all of this out, I think. One of the other questions I was pretty interested in, it relates to a question that Colin also fancied. I don't know who should answer this one. I'm glad I'm not on the panel. In terms of ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence technologies being used by staff, where are the lines there? For example, would it ever be appropriate to use them for marking and feedback of students' work? George, nice one.
So my take on that is, it's a technology. It's not illegal. It makes us smarter. It solves mundane tasks that allow us to, elevate or move up the ranking of creativity, or to solve more complex tasks and activities. So my take on it is, if it's legal and if you can use it, use it. Teach students how to use it. Like, I'm all AI all the time.
There's a big difference between legal and moral.
No, there is, but I'm saying, like, from what end, how would you frame that in this case? And what aspect of using it as a teacher would you define as being immoral? Or is there a domain at which, like, if I'm going to use it to give students better feedback on their assignments, where would you cross over into an immoral line in that end from your perspective?
I guess I have a few thoughts. Like, how are we in a position where a computer can give better feedback than an educator? And that's a much broader discussion for learning and teaching. I wonder how students would respond if should there be acknowledgement that their feedback has been generated through AI? Are students going to feel as though they're kind of being robbed of the teacher doing their job in some ways? I mean, I get it, it's a tool, and maybe it is actually helpful. I think there's a whole other question, is if the feedback goes wrong and the student follows it and the student fails and they appeal their grade, how does the institution deal with that? Trish is nodding.
I'm nodding. I'm happy to say my apologies. I had a bit of a technical malfunction there, thanks to EduRoam. As those of us in Australia know that's our system. So I had to frantically hotspot. Yeah, look, I'm sorry I missed the last question. And with this, the one about should we use students, put students' material into it or mark their work, I think that Phil Dawson has had quite a few thoughts on that one around its student data and putting it into an opaque system where we don't know how that information will be used. But in terms of actually getting the bot to write feedback, they've been doing that for years. School reports now are usually generated with automatic canned responses that are put in, and the kids recognize it. So, say, oh, this teacher says that you're good at whatever, or you're doing well. And they didn't write that. That came from, and that's a normal practice. So where the responses come from or who writes them is students quickly figure out authenticity and care factor.
I wonder, let's say a rubric, how is a rubric different than using ChatGPT?
ChatGPT can generate some brilliant rubrics.
Rubric is a pre-structured kind of model. Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at, I'm trying to unpack, I think Colin raised a really important topic, which is, where does the morality of using a technology to provide feedback students start to run into a line that makes people uncomfortable? And what is it specifically about ChatGPT when we use different technologies and tools all the time in our teaching and our evaluation? I'm not quite sure if the slippery student failing, but it's I think a question to unpack on what that might look like in the long run.
To just jump in quickly here, I actually think again, to a point I think I made previously, is that we of course might be looking at it as, the usual way is that student submits an assignment, then there's this one-step feedback that comes back. I actually think that sort of flow we need to start thinking about as a chatbot that perhaps students might interact with to get feedback incrementally on what they're doing. And that takes much better advantage of what the underlying technologies and what ChatGPT as a chatbot is quite good at. It's how we prompt it to give and train it to give those right responses. And, there's a lot of, I think from UTS, there's a lot of learning analytics research on writing analytics, and it's how we combine all of that with the ChatGPT technology to actually get these incremental writing feedback or, problem solving feedback integrated in what we do. It's less to me about the feedback comments that an academic might write right at the end. It's being part of the learning process and integrating these tools into the learning process. And I think then students are less likely to get upset that it's written by an AI.
So here we are with 3 minutes to go, thinking we've covered an awful lot of territory and there needs to be some sort of way of closing down a session that is massively open, covers a lot of territory. We want it to be reasonably positive, so we could go to George for this, but then we also have a lot of people, I think, in the audience who are quite worried about the short-term practical side of things. So I'm thinking about Anna and I'm thinking about George. If you can just start readying your minds for like a kind of maybe a final statement from Anna about some sort of practical approach that you could take in the short term, and then something from George to make us feel better about the future. And then Colin, if you want, you might want to say a final word as the sort of organizer of this session. Does that sound okay? But please keep it brief, because otherwise people will have to leave during your amazing statements.
Okay, I would just say to focus in our assessments on intrinsic motivation and engagement with students, and to just start to establish these norm of transparency around when we're using AI assistance and when we're not, and how we're using it. And that can go along with some introduction of a critical AI literacy. As we're learning, we can share with students some basic information about how these models work and what their limitations are. And, that may lead to discussions of what their appropriate uses are. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think I don't want to be sort of Pollyannish in the general orientation. I think I'm encouraged, though, by the ways in which AI can handle routine sort of systemically relevant but learning irrelevant activities. And so I think that is the sort of dynamic that I see promising. I also see it promising that there's genuine degree of excitement around learning and engaging with ideas and shaping and sharing and creating, and the thrill of discovering something new. I think the part that still fascinates me most about ChatGPT is the ready transfer from one information state to another information state with whatever layer you've added over it, whether it is in the style of Shakespeare or bell hooks or whatever it is that you end up doing. I think that's the part that we shouldn't lose sight of our existential angst of, oh my goodness, what's it going to do, and experience that we're actually in a really fascinating, explosive period of time of direct engagement with learning system of public conversation on. I think that's important. As I noted earlier, there are key issues around the consequences of equity and access that cannot be ignored. Those are first line conversation, and the second first line conversation is around harm, especially to people who are traditionally marginalized or excluded from the school system. Those are non-negotiables in the conversation. Everything that follows later, once we've had or at least made that central to the ongoing discussion, the rest of the details we backfill.
I made it through the entire thing without talking on mute. There we go. Look, this has been a wonderful session, and I would really like to thank everyone who's been involved in this. I feel incredibly encouraged about the vibe and just the general kind of thinking that is going on. We're mindful of the accessibility, the equity, the fairness, and the opportunities in this space. For educators and advisors and leaders out there, I think we just need to keep this conversation going and think about all the ways that this will potentially reshape learning and teaching. So thank you also, Tim, obviously, for doing such a marvellous job wrangling cats. The next TELedvisors webinar will be at the start or at the end of February, and it will be, again, with a focus on AI and specifically academic integrity questions, and we will promote some information with that. So with that, I will thank you all and have a great day.